Good evening and welcome, humble viewer. I am so delighted that you are able to join us on this journey. Now please try and find that quiet space in your home, in your day, and let the noise of the modern world recede. Please take a second to comment below where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you, as it always offers a sense of interconnection. We are about to travel back, not just in time, but into a different way of seeing the world, a different understanding of the human body itself. Before we can walk in the suffocating leather boots of the plague doctor, before we can peer through the dark glass eyes of his beaked mask, we must first understand the world that made him. We must enter the mind of the medieval physician. For the plague doctor was not born in a vacuum. He was the desperate and grotesque culmination of a medical tradition that was ancient, intricate, deeply believed, and almost entirely wrong. His future misery was pre-written in the vellum pages of books that had been revered for 1,000 years. To understand why his job was a hopeless, soul-crushing nightmare, we must first see the world as he saw it. A world not of cells and viruses, but of humours and spirits. A world lit by the dim, flickering light of superstition and governed by the unshakable authority of long-dead men. The entire edifice of medieval European medicine rested upon the colossal authority of one man, Galen of Pergamon. A Greek physician who practiced in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD, Galen was a brilliant anatomist, though his dissections were largely confined to apes and pigs, a fact that would have profound consequences. A prolific writer and a synthesizer of all the medical knowledge that had come before him, his output was immense, and his system was so comprehensive, so intellectually satisfying, that for the next 1,300 years, to challenge Galen was not just to challenge a physician, it was to challenge the very foundations of nature and logic. His works were preserved by Arabic scholars after the fall of Rome and were later translated back into Latin, becoming the absolute, unquestioned gospel in the great medical universities of Salerno, Montpellier, Bologna, and Paris. A medieval physician's education did not consist of experimentation or discovery. It consisted of memorizing, commenting upon, and defending the sacred texts of Galen. And the core doctrine of this unshakable gospel was the theory of the four humours. This was the lens through which every single aspect of health and sickness was viewed. The theory held that the human body, a microcosm of the universe, was composed of four fundamental fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was linked to one of the four classical elements: air, water, fire, earth, one of the four seasons, and one of the four essential qualities: hot, cold, moist, dry. Blood was hot and moist, like air in the spring. Phlegm was cold and moist, like water in the winter. Yellow bile, or choler, was hot and dry, like fire in the summer. And black bile, or melancholy, was cold and dry, like earth in the autumn. A person's health was not a state of being, but a state of perfect, delicate balance among these four fluids. Sickness, therefore, was never an invasion from the outside. It was always an internal problem, a state of imbalance or dysgratia. To be sick was to have too much or too little of a particular humour, or to have a humour that had become corrupted or putrefied within the body. This theory, in its elegant symmetry, had an answer for everything. A man with a fever, a flushed face, and a rapid pulse was clearly suffering from an excess of hot and moist blood. A person with a runny nose, a cough, and a lethargic demeanour was clearly afflicted by a surplus of cold and moist phlegm. An angry, irritable person had an excess of hot, dry, yellow bile. And a person who was sad, withdrawn, and depressive was drowning in cold, dry, black bile. The physician's task, therefore, was never to identify and attack an external pathogen, a concept that did not exist. His one and only goal was to help the body restore its natural equilibrium. The entire practice of medieval medicine was a collection of techniques designed to add, subtract, or alter these four precious, problematic fluids. The primary and most iconic tool in this quest for balance was phlebotomy, or bloodletting, since so many illnesses, particularly fevers and inflammations, were attributed to an excess of blood, plethora. The most logical course of action was to simply remove some. This was not a fringe practice. It was the bedrock of therapeutic medicine, used for everything from a headache to a seizure to a simple feeling of malaise. A university-trained physician, a man of high status who would rarely deign to perform messy manual labor, would make the diagnosis. He would then turn the actual procedure over to a lower-class practitioner, typically a barber surgeon. The barber surgeons, whose striped pole today still represents the bloody bandages of their ancient trade, were the hands-on technicians of the medical world. The procedure itself was a grim ritual. The barber surgeon would consult complex charts that linked parts of the body to the signs of the zodiac, determining the most auspicious day and location on the body for the letting. The letting could be done through venesection, the direct cutting of a vein, usually in the crook of the elbow, with a small, terrifyingly sharp knife called a lancet. The blood would be collected in a special bowl, its volume carefully measured. The physician might inspect the blood as it cooled, observing its color and consistency for further diagnostic clues. Alternatively, the letting could be done through scarification and cupping. The barber surgeon would make a series of shallow cuts in the skin with a multi-bladed instrument and then place a heated glass cup over the cuts. As the air in the cup cooled, it would create a vacuum, sucking the blood out of the wounds. For more localized ailments, leeches were applied, their greedy, anesthetic mouths serving as tiny, living phlebotomy instruments. The amount of blood let could be substantial, enough to cause the patient to faint. An event often seen as a positive sign that the body's excess humor had been successfully purged. While this practice would be catastrophic when later applied to plague victims who needed to conserve all their strength, it was, in the world before the plague, the absolute standard of care, a reassuring and universal ritual of purification. If the problem was not an excess of blood, but a corruption of the other humors, the physician's goal was to purge them from the body. This meant inducing vomiting or diarrhea through the use of powerful and often toxic substances. Emetics, to make a patient vomit up corrupted phlegm or yellow bile, could include hellebore or antimony. Purgatives and laxatives, to cleanse the bowels of black bile, could be concoctions of senna, rhubarb, or even more dangerous substances containing mercury. The medieval patient was subjected to a violent, full-body assault, their system flushed from both ends in a desperate attempt to expel the offending humors. The physician would stand by, observing the evacuations with clinical interest, seeking signs that the body was returning to its proper balance. The second great pillar of medieval diagnosis, alongside the pulse and the general appearance of the patient, was uroscopy. The obsessive examination of a patient's urine was considered the ultimate diagnostic art, a window into the inner workings of the body. A physician would have a special glass flask called a medulla, shaped like a bladder, in which a sample of the patient's urine would be collected. He would hold this flask up to the light, examining the contents with the focused intensity of a jeweler inspecting a diamond. He would scrutinize its color against a detailed wheel-like chart that offered some 20 different shades, from a healthy, pale straw color to a deathly, opaque black. He would study its density, its clarity, and the nature of any sediment it contained. He might even go so far as to smell it, and in some cases, to taste it, seeking the telltale sweetness that, even then, was sometimes associated with diabetes. From this simple flask of urine, the medieval physician believed he could diagnose everything from a common cold to lovesickness to a fatal impairment of the liver. The image of the physician holding the medulla became the defining symbol of the medical profession, a sign of his profound and esoteric knowledge. This reliance on a single, often misleading data point would prove utterly useless when confronted with a disease as rapid and systemic as the plague. Beyond the internal balance of the humors, the medieval physician believed the human body was inextricably linked to the cosmos. Astrology was not a fringe superstition, it was a core medical science. The macrocosm of the heavens was believed to directly influence the microcosm of the human body. Each sign of the zodiac governed a specific part of the body, from Aries ruling the head down to Pisces ruling the feet. A physician would never dare to perform a surgery or even a simple bloodletting without first consulting an astrological chart. To operate on the legs when the moon was in Pisces was to court disaster. The physician would carefully calculate the positions of the planets and stars to determine the most auspicious time for any treatment and to offer a prognosis for the course of the illness. This celestial connection gave the physician an aura of mystical authority, but it rooted his practice in a fatalistic system that had nothing to do with the patient's actual biology. The medieval pharmacy, the apothecary's shop, was a treasure trove of botanical, mineral, and animal-based remedies, their use often dictated by the doctrine of signatures. This was a belief that God, in his infinite wisdom, had left clues or signatures in the appearance of plants to indicate their medicinal purpose. A plant with a heart-shaped leaf, like the wood sorrel, was obviously intended to treat ailments of the heart. The lungwort, with its spotted leaves resembling a diseased lung, was used for respiratory conditions. Walnuts, with their brain-like appearance, were prescribed for headaches and mental disorders. This was not science, but a kind of poetic, theological botany. While some of these herbal remedies, through sheer chance, did contain active chemical compounds and had real physiological effects, their application was based on a system of magical correspondence rather than empirical evidence. The apothecary's shelves would also contain more exotic and expensive ingredients sourced from the far corners of the known world. There were powdered precious stones like emeralds and pearls believed to have purifying properties. There was potable gold, a solution of gold dissolved in acid, thought to be a powerful tonic. And there were ghoulish concoctions derived from animals, dried toad, powdered snake, and most prized of all, mummy, a powder scraped from the preserved bodies of ancient Egyptians, believed to be a powerful cure-all. This was the world of medicine before the Black Death. It was a world of immense intellectual confidence built on a foundation of sand. The physicians were men of great learning, deeply read in the ancient texts, capable of debating the finest points of Galen's theories in elegant Latin. They were respected, often wealthy, and held a high social status, but their entire system was designed to treat a set of diseases and conditions that were chronic, slow-moving, or self-limiting. It was a medicine of balance and correspondence, of astrology and philosophy. It was profoundly and dangerously unequipped to deal with what was coming. It is crucial to understand the hierarchy of this world. At the very top was the university-trained physician. He was a man of letters, a doctor of philosophy, as much as of medicine. He rarely, if ever, touched his patients. His job was to observe from a distance, to examine the urine, to consult his books and charts, to make a diagnosis, and to prescribe a course of treatment. The messy, hands-on work was left to those lower down the social ladder. The barber surgeons handled the bloodletting, the lancing of abscesses, the setting of bones, and the amputation of limbs. They were craftsmen, not intellectuals. Below them were the apothecaries, who mixed the strange and wonderful prescriptions. And at the bottom were a host of folk healers, midwives, and village wise women, whose knowledge was based on local tradition rather than learned texts. This rigid hierarchy would be one of the first things to shatter under the onslaught of the plague. The great physicians, with their expensive fees and their deep knowledge of Galen, would prove just as useless as the humble village herbalist. And their instinct, when faced with a true epidemic, was often to save themselves. They were among the first to flee the plague-ridden cities, leaving the poor and the middle classes to their fate. This, then, was the tragic inheritance of the man who would become the plague doctor. He would be summoned into existence by a crisis that his entire medical tradition was powerless to explain or combat. He would be armed only with these flawed theories and futile treatments. He would be asked to fight an invisible, fast-acting, and overwhelmingly lethal enemy, an enemy that did not care about the balance of the humours or the position of the stars. His future job would be a nightmare, not just because of the death and despair that would surround him, but because he would be forced to face that nightmare armed with nothing but the elegant, intricate, and utterly useless knowledge of a world that had ceased to exist. He was a creature of medieval medicine, and medieval medicine was about to be put on trial by the greatest catastrophe in human history and be found catastrophically wanting. The shadow of the plague was gathering, and the world of the four humours was about to be drowned in a sea of blood and black bile. The world of balanced humours and celestial certainties, the fragile, ordered cosmos of the medieval physician, was about to be shattered. It would not be broken by a new philosophy or a revolutionary text, but by an invisible tide of death that was already creeping across the known world, a biological wave of such terrifying magnitude that it would unmake civilization itself. Long before the first black ships appeared on the horizon of the Mediterranean, the rumours arrived. They were faint at first, carried like dust on the wind along the great trade routes of the Silk Road, whispered by wide-eyed merchants in the caravanserai of the Levant and the bustling ports of Alexandria and Constantinople. They were tales of a great pestilence, a biblical affliction that had descended upon the distant lands of the Orient, upon Cathay and the vast, unknown steppes of the Mongol Empire. These were stories that strained credulity, tales of entire cities rendered silent, of provinces where the living were not numerous enough to bury the dead. They spoke of a disease that killed with shocking speed, that struck down the young and the strong as easily as the old and the infirm. The Genoese and Venetian traders who dominated the eastern trade routes passed these stories westward, where they were received in the courts and universities of Europe as exotic, horrifying fables, another example of the strangeness of the East. To the scholastic mind of the mid-14th century, such a plague seemed a remote, almost mythical event, something that happened to other people, to infidels and barbarians in faraway lands. The scholars and physicians of Europe, secure in their Galenic knowledge and their Christian faith, listened with a mixture of fear and smug superiority. They read the apocalyptic portents in these tales, a sign of God's displeasure with the wider world, a fulfillment of prophecies, but they could not conceive that this monstrous, formless terror could ever breach the walls of Christendom. They could not imagine that the pestilence was already on the move, making its inexorable way towards them, carried not on the winds of divine wrath, but in the blood of fleas and the bodies of black rats nesting in the holds of their own trading ships. The moment the fable became a terrifying reality, the moment the pestilence breached the gates of Europe, can be traced to a specific and horrifying event: the siege of Kaffa in the year 1346. Kaffa, a thriving and wealthy trading post on the Crimean peninsula of the Black Sea, was a jewel in the mercantile empire of Genoa. It was a bustling, fortified city, a gateway through which the riches of the East flowed into Europe. In that year, the city found itself under siege by the formidable army of the Golden Horde, led by the Khan, Jani Beg. The siege was long and arduous, a grinding stalemate between the Mongol forces outside the walls and the determined Genoese defenders within. And then a new and terrible ally joined the Mongol cause. The plague, which had been sweeping through Central Asia, erupted with devastating force within the packed, unsanitary confines of the besieging army's camp. The Mongol soldiers began to die in their thousands. The siege faltered, the great army of the Khan dissolving into a mass of feverish, delirious, dying men. A conventional commander might have abandoned the siege, retreating to save what was left of his army. But Jani Beg, in a moment of desperate, malevolent genius, decided to give his enemy the gift that was destroying his own people. He ordered his men to load the plague-ridden corpses of their comrades onto their massive siege engines, their trebuchets. What followed was one of the most infamous and horrifying acts of biological warfare in human history. The great arms of the trebuchets swung upwards, and the swollen, blackened bodies of the dead were hurled through the air, tumbling over the high stone walls of Kaffa and landing with sickening thuds in the streets and squares of the besieged city. The Italian chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, who described the event, wrote that the defenders were confronted with a terrifying rain of death, as if mountains of the dead were thrown into the city. The defenders, horrified, tried to dispose of the bodies, dragging them away and throwing them into the sea as quickly as they could. But it was too late. The damage was done. The air, they believed, was now hopelessly poisoned by the stench and putrefaction of the corpses. The true mechanism of transmission was, of course, far more insidious. The fleas that had infested the bodies of the dead soldiers now abandoned their cooling hosts, leaping onto the warm bodies of the terrified citizens of Kaffa and their animal companions, the city's rats. Within days, the pestilence had taken root inside the walls. The city that had withstood the Mongol army was now being consumed from within by an invisible enemy. The siege was effectively over. A handful of Genoese galleys, their holds filled with silks, spices, and now the seeds of apocalypse, managed to break the blockade and escape the dying city, setting sail westward, back towards home. These ships were not vessels of escape. They were floating tombs, sea-borne coffins crewed by dying men. As they sailed across the Black Sea, the plague moved with them. Sailors would sicken and die in a matter of days, their bodies thrown overboard, but the rats in the dark, warm holds thrived, and the fleas in the cargo of cloth and grain multiplied. The ships became mobile vectors of death, desperately seeking a port while their crews dwindled. They were turned away from Constantinople, whose people saw the sickness and death clinging to their rigging. They were denied entry to other ports in the Aegean. Finally, in October of 1347, a fleet of 12 Genoese galleys, the Death Ships, arrived at the bustling port of Messina in Sicily. The people of Messina gathered at the harbour to greet the ships from the east. What they saw was a vision from hell. The galleys drifted into the port with many of their oarsmen dead at their benches. The few sailors who were still alive were spectres, skeletal figures staggering on the decks, their bodies covered in dark blotches and grotesque, painful swellings. They were delirious with fever, sickness clinging to their bones, as one chronicler wrote. The initial pity of the townspeople quickly turned to sheer, unadulterated terror as they helped the ships to dock and unload their goods. The plague, having crossed the sea, now leaped from the ships to the shore. The rats scurried down the mooring ropes, disappearing into the warehouses and cellars of the city, and the fleas found a new, uninfected population to feast upon. The disease that now exploded in Messina was unlike anything the physicians of Sicily had ever encountered. This was not the slow, predictable progression of a humoral imbalance. This was a biological firestorm. The first symptom was a sudden, violent fever accompanied by chills and a debilitating headache. The patient would become weak, dizzy, and overwhelmed by a sense of profound dread. Then came the characteristic signs that gave the Black Death its name. Dark, bruise-like blotches, called lenticulae, little lentils, would appear on the skin, caused by subcutaneous hemorrhaging. The patient's nervous system would begin to fail, leading to delirium, slurred speech, and uncontrolled spasms. And then came the bubo. A hard, excruciatingly painful swelling would appear in the lymph nodes of the groin, the armpits, or the neck. The bubo would grow with terrifying speed, sometimes to the size of a small apple or a hen's egg. It would turn a dark purple or black, its center becoming necrotic. For most, the appearance of the bubo was a death sentence. Death usually followed within 3 to 5 days. The Sicilian authorities, in a panic, expelled the Genoese galleys from their harbour, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire by swatting at a single spark. The pestilence was loose in Europe. From Messina, it spread with horrifying speed across Sicily and then leapt to the Italian mainland. By January of 1348, it had reached Genoa and Venice, the two great maritime republics that had unwittingly served as its vehicles of transmission. From there, it radiated outwards, following the busy trade routes that were the arteries of medieval Europe. It moved up the Italian peninsula, engulfing Pisa, Florence, and Siena. It was carried by ship to the port of Marseille, from which it spread into France and Spain. It moved north across the Alps into the Holy Roman Empire and across the Channel into England. By 1350, it had reached the far corners of the continent, from the fjords of Scandinavia to the plains of Poland. It was an unstoppable, all-consuming wave. And as the plague advanced, the entire edifice of medieval medicine, the proud, confident world of Galen and the four humours, collapsed into catastrophic, abject failure. The university-trained physicians, the men who could quote Avicenna from memory and debate the subtleties of Aristotle, were rendered utterly powerless. They applied their trusted methods, the therapies that had been honed for 1,000 years, and watched in horror as they not only failed, but seemed to hasten their patients' demise. They tried bloodletting. Faced with a patient burning with fever, his pulse racing, they saw a clear case of excess blood. The barber surgeons were summoned, the lancets were sharpened, and the veins were opened. They bled patients who were already suffering from internal hemorrhaging, whose circulatory systems were collapsing under the strain of the infection. They drained the lifeblood from bodies that desperately needed it to fight, weakening them, pushing them faster towards shock and death. They saw the blood that flowed out was dark and thick, and they interpreted this as a sign of the blood's putrefaction, a confirmation of their theory, spurring them to let even more. They tried purges. Believing the body was filled with a poisonous humor that needed to be expelled, they administered powerful emetics and laxatives. They forced these violent concoctions on people whose bodies were already racked with vomiting and diarrhea, causing extreme dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, pushing their weakened systems over the edge. They saw these evacuations as a success, a sign that the body was cleansing itself, even as the patient expired before their eyes. They relied on uroscopy. The physician would solemnly hold the medulla of a plague victim's urine up to the light. The urine was often dark, cloudy, or tinged with blood, a clear sign, according to their charts, of a fatal corruption of the humors. The physician would gravely pronounce a fatal prognosis, offering a learned explanation for the patient's impending doom, but offering absolutely no effective cure. The great diagnostic art of the medieval world was reduced to a tool for confirming hopelessness. When their physical medicine failed, they turned to spiritual cures, but God, it seemed, was not listening. The churches were packed with the terrified and the dying, the air thick with the smoke of candles and the sound of desperate prayer. People clung to holy relics, they made vows to saints, but the saints were silent. In a desperate attempt to appease God's wrath, which many saw as the ultimate cause of the pestilence, great religious processions were organized. Thousands of people would march through the streets, led by priests chanting litanies. Among the most dramatic of these were the flagellants, groups of penitents who would whip their own backs with leather scourges tipped with iron, believing that by sharing in Christ's suffering, they could atone for the sins of the world and turn away the divine anger. These processions, with their large, panicked crowds of people packed closely together, became horrifying super-spreader events, accelerating the transmission of the disease through the very act of trying to stop it. The utter failure of both medicine and religion to halt the inexorable advance of the plague led to a complete and terrifying unraveling of the social fabric. The most vivid account of this societal breakdown comes from the Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in his city, and whose introduction to his masterpiece, The Decameron, is a chilling eyewitness report. The first to flee, Boccaccio tells us, were those with the means, the wealthy merchants, the nobles, and, crucially for our story, the most esteemed and expensive physicians. They abandoned their cities, their duties, and their patients, fleeing to their isolated country villas, hoping to wait out the storm in comfort and safety. Their flight created a massive professional vacuum, leaving the cities without their most experienced leaders and doctors at the very moment they were needed most. With the collapse of authority came the collapse of basic human decency. Fear, Boccaccio writes, dissolved the sacred bonds of family and community. Brother abandoned brother, the uncle his nephew, the sister her brother, and in many cases, the wife her husband. The most terrible and unnatural breakdown was between parent and child. Fathers and mothers, he wrote, were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, as if they had not been theirs. The horror of this statement is difficult to fully grasp. People became so terrified of the contagion that they would refuse to care for their own dying family members, leaving them to suffer and expire alone. Homes became tombs. A person who fell ill was often sealed inside their house and left to their fate, their cries for help going unanswered. The most basic rituals of death, which are central to the dignity of any culture, were completely abandoned. There were no more solemn funerals, no more grieving processions to the churchyard. The death carts, the bikini, roamed the streets, their drivers shouting, "Bring out your dead!" Bodies were dragged from homes with little ceremony and piled onto the carts like refuse. When the churchyards filled up, massive plague pits were dug outside the city walls. The chroniclers describe the grim scene of the carts arriving at these pits at all hours of the day and night. The corpses were tipped into the trenches, layer upon layer, like lasagna, as one writer horrifyingly put it, with thin sprinklings of earth between them until the pits were full. To die in such a way, without last rites, without a proper burial, was for the medieval Christian a profound spiritual terror, a damnation of the soul as well as the body. It was into this abyss, this complete and utter vacuum of medical care, civic order, and human compassion that a new figure had to be born. The elite physicians were gone. The traditional remedies were useless, the social structure had crumbled, but the sick were still dying, the bodies were still piling up, and someone had to deal with the grim realities. City councils in places like Florence, Venice, and Milan, their own ranks decimated and their cities paralyzed with fear, became desperate. They needed someone, anyone, to perform the most basic, horrifying tasks that civilization required. They needed a man who would be willing, for a price, to walk into the heart of the pestilence. They needed someone to officially diagnose the plague in a household, to serve as a witness for the hastily scribbled wills of the dying, and most importantly, to keep records, to count the dead, so the state could have some measure of the catastrophe overwhelming it. And so, the desperate civic authorities began to draw up a new kind of legal document, the plague doctor's contract. They offered what seemed like a fortune, a salary that a normal physician might not see in a lifetime, to any man who would agree to become a medico della peste, a community plague doctor employed by the city and dedicated solely to treating, or rather processing, the victims of the pestilence. Who would take such a job? Who would willingly sign a contract that was, in all likelihood, a death warrant? It was rarely the best and the brightest. The men who answered these calls were often at the margins of the medical profession. They were young, inexperienced physicians fresh out of university, without an established practice or wealthy patrons. They were doctors who had failed elsewhere, who had a reputation for incompetence or drunkenness. Sometimes they were not doctors at all, but charlatans, former fruit sellers or friars who saw an opportunity to make a fortune, possessing no medical knowledge beyond a few folk remedies. These were the men who, lured by the promise of exorbitant wealth if they could somehow survive, and driven by a lack of other options, agreed to step into the impossible role. They signed the contract, becoming not heroic healers but desperate, often second-rate, municipal functionaries. They were not knights going forth to slay the dragon. They were janitors being hired to clean up its carnage. This was the birth of the plague doctor, a profession conceived in terror and born of utter desperation. His story was just beginning, and it was already a tragedy. To walk in the shoes of a plague doctor, to understand the suffocating reality of his life, one must first learn to see the world through his eyes. But more importantly, one must learn to smell the world as he did. For the entire intellectual and practical framework of his profession, every action he took, every piece of his bizarre and terrifying costume, was built upon a single, powerful, and catastrophically wrong idea. It was a theory that made the physician's own senses, particularly his sense of smell, his primary diagnostic tool, and, simultaneously, his greatest source of terror. This was the doctrine of miasma, the unshakable belief that the great pestilence, the Black Death, was a poison that traveled not through the touch of a person or the bite of an insect, but through the very air one breathed. To the medieval mind, the plague was a pestilential vapor, a bad air, a corrupt and death-bearing fog that rose from the earth and smothered the world. The theory of miasma was not a new or radical idea born of the plague's panic. Its roots were ancient, stretching back to the very foundations of Western medicine. Hippocrates, the great Greek physician of the 5th century BC, had written extensively about the influence of airs, waters, and places on human health. He observed that people living near stagnant marshes or in low-lying, poorly ventilated areas were more prone to fevers and sickness. Galen, the great synthesizer whose work formed the bedrock of medieval medicine, expanded upon this. He taught that air could become corrupted and putrefied, just as food or water could. This putrefaction could be caused by a variety of factors: the exhalations from swamps and undrained pools, the filth of crowded and unsanitary cities, the stench of decaying organic matter like garbage and corpses, and even cosmic events. A key contributing factor, it was widely believed, was the unfortunate alignment of the planets. The great medical faculty at the University of Paris, asked by the King of France in 1348 to explain the cause of the Black Death, produced a solemn and learned report. They concluded, after much scholarly deliberation, that the ultimate cause was a great and deadly conjunction of 3 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, in the sign of Aquarius. This celestial event, they argued, had drawn up evil vapors from the earth and the sea, which now drifted across the globe as a pestilential fog, killing all they touched. This theory was not foolishness to the people of the time. It was the highest form of science, a satisfyingly holistic explanation that linked the microcosm of the human body to the macrocosm of the universe. And most critically, it seemed to align perfectly with their lived sensory experience. The medieval city was an olfactory battleground, a place of overwhelming and often nauseating smells. The streets were narrow, unpaved, and served as open sewers. People tossed their household waste, including animal entrails from butchers' shops and the contents of their chamber pots, directly into the thoroughfares. The river systems that flowed through major cities like London or Paris were thick with human and industrial waste, the tanneries and slaughterhouses dumping their foul byproducts directly into the water. In the sweltering heat of summer, the stench rising from this urban landscape, a thick, soupy combination of rot, excrement, and decay, was overpowering. When the plague arrived, killing thousands daily, the problem escalated into a full-blown crisis. The bodies of the dead, often left inside houses for days or piled in the streets awaiting the death carts, added a new and uniquely horrifying layer to the city's foul perfume. Within the miasma theory, this direct sensory evidence was paramount. If something smelled foul, it was not just unpleasant, it was considered actively, lethally dangerous. The nose became the body's first line of defense, a sentinel warning of the presence of invisible, airborne poison. A bad smell was the smell of death itself. This created a profound psychological link between odor and disease, a terror of foul air that governed public and private life. People would walk around holding pomanders to their noses, small, ornate metal balls filled with fragrant substances like ambergris, musk, or cloves. They would carry bouquets of flowers called posies to create a small, personal bubble of safe, fragrant air. Wealthy households would burn juniper, rosemary, or expensive incense throughout the day, attempting to fumigate their homes and drive out the corrupt vapors. This belief is the origin of the nursery rhyme, Ring Around the Rosy, a song that is a chilling folk memory of the plague. The rosy refers to the rash-like sores, the pocket full of posies, to the herbs carried for protection, and the ashes, we all fall down, to the final, inevitable outcome for so many. This terror of the air led to a series of frantic and large-scale public health measures, all aimed at cleansing the atmosphere. City authorities, acting on the advice of their physicians, would order massive bonfires to be lit on street corners and in public squares. They would burn aromatic woods like pine and cypress, the thick, resinous smoke intended to purify the air and combat the unseen miasma. The ringing of church bells was not just for funerals. It was believed that the powerful sound waves could literally shatter the pestilential vapors in the air, breaking them apart and rendering them harmless. The air itself became an enemy to be fought with fire, sound, and scent. This understanding of disease also led to tragic and misguided interventions. Since miasma was thought to rise from filth and decay, authorities launched campaigns to clean the cities. This in itself was a positive step. However, the theory also implicated animals. The warm bodies and foul odors associated with domestic animals led to the belief that they were generators or carriers of miasma. In a catastrophic error, cities across Europe ordered the mass slaughter of dogs and cats. This act, intended to purify the urban environment, had the exact opposite effect. By killing off the natural predators of the black rat, the Rattus rattus, they inadvertently allowed the primary carrier of the plague flea to proliferate unchecked, pouring fuel on the biological fire. The very act of trying to fight the bad air made the true source of the plague stronger. This, then, was the intellectual prison in which the plague doctor was trapped. His entire mandate, the very reason for his existence, was predicated on this flawed theory. He was not hired to kill a germ or fight an infection in the modern sense. His contractual duty was to combat the miasma and its effects on the human body. This defined his every action and turned his work into an exercise in heroic futility. His job had two primary components, both born directly from miasma theory. First, he had to protect himself from breathing the poisoned air. Second, he had to treat the patient, whose body was believed to have been invaded and corrupted by this same bad air, resulting in a fatal imbalance of the humours. The first duty, self-protection, led directly to the creation of the most iconic and terrifying element of his attire, the beaked mask. The famous plague doctor costume, with its bird-like mask, wide-brimmed hat and long leather coat, is most famously associated with the plague outbreaks of the 17th century, particularly the work of the French physician Charles Delorme. However, the principles behind it were active much earlier, and it represents the ultimate physical manifestation of miasma theory. It was a personal, mobile anti-miasma device, a head-to-toe suit of armor against a poisoned atmosphere. The beak was its most critical component. It was not designed to be frightening or to evoke the image of a scavenging bird of death, though it certainly had that effect. It was, in essence, a primitive gas mask, a portable air filter. The long, hollow beak, sometimes up to 6 inches in length, was packed with a complex and powerfully aromatic blend of substances collectively known as theriac. This ancient and complex medicinal compound, containing dozens of ingredients including herbs, spices, and sometimes viper's flesh and opium, was believed to be a powerful antidote to poison. Alongside theriac, the beak would be stuffed with a potent potpourri of other fragrant materials. Dried flowers like roses and carnations, herbs like mint, sage and rosemary, spices like cloves and camphor, and a sponge soaked in vinegar. The theory was simple. The doctor would breathe only through the beak. The air, before it could reach his nostrils, would be forced to pass through this thick, aromatic filter. The powerful, good scent of the herbs was believed to overpower, neutralize, and purify the bad scent of the miasma, rendering it harmless. The doctor was, in effect, walking around in his own personal cloud of protective perfume. The reality of wearing such a device must have been miserable. The world would be reduced to a cloying, overwhelmingly strong smell of herbs and vinegar, a scent that would permeate his senses all day, every day. It would make his eyes water and likely give him a constant, dull headache. It was the smell of his fear, a fragile, fragrant shield against a world of death. The second part of the doctor's mandate was to treat the patient. Since the patient's body had been invaded by the poisonous miasma, the physician's goal was to help the body expel this poison. The bubo, the painful, swollen lymph node, was interpreted through this lens. It was not seen as a site of infection in the modern sense, but as a localized collection point where the body's vital heat was fighting against the pestilential humor, pushing the poison to the surface. The logical course of action, therefore, was to help this process along, to open a gateway for the poison to escape. This led to the primary cure offered by the plague doctor, the lancing, draining and cauterizing of the buboes. This brutal procedure, which we will explore in agonizing detail later, was a direct consequence of seeing the disease not as a systemic infection, but as a pocket of trapped, corrupted matter. Similarly, other treatments were designed to combat the internal effects of the miasma. The patient would be encouraged to sweat profusely, often by being wrapped in heavy blankets and placed near a fire, in the belief that the poison could be sweated out. They were given cordials and potions designed to fortify the heart and resist the putrefaction of the humours. These often contained ingredients like powdered emeralds, pearls, or gold, their value and purity believed to impart strength to the patient. And of course, there was bloodletting. The dark, thick blood of a plague victim was seen as clear evidence of the humour's corruption by miasma, justifying the removal of large quantities of it, a practice that only hastened the patient's death. The doctor's preventative advice to the healthy was also entirely based on miasma theory. He would advise people to flee contaminated areas, which was sound advice, but for the wrong reason. He would instruct them to keep their windows closed, especially on the south side, as the warm, moist south wind was believed to be a carrier of plague vapors. He would prescribe diets of sour foods and forbid bathing, as warm water was thought to open the pores of the skin, making the body more vulnerable to the entry of bad air. He would advise against any form of exercise, passion, or even joy, as these activities were thought to heat the blood and make the humors more susceptible to corruption. The ideal state was one of cool, calm, and fearful inactivity. Thus, the entire world of the plague doctor was built on this single, fundamental error. He was a man fighting a ghost. He dedicated his life to fighting a bad smell, while the true killer, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, passed silently and invisibly from flea to rat to human, completely bypassing his fragrant defenses. His mask, his potions, his brutal surgeries, they were all weapons designed for a different war, aimed at an enemy that wasn't there. This is the first and perhaps the most profound layer of his misery. It was not just that he was surrounded by death. It was that he was tasked with fighting it, and every single tool he was given, every single theory he had been taught was utterly and completely useless. He was a prisoner of the bad air, a man whose entire existence was a testament to the terrifying gap between what he thought he knew and the devastating reality of what he did not. His tragedy was not one of ignorance, but of misplaced, deeply held, and fatal certainty. We have established the poisoned world that created the plague doctor, a world built on the terror of a foul and deadly wind. Now we must inhabit his skin. We must don the strange, spectral uniform that was his prison, the iconic costume that has haunted the Western imagination for centuries. This uniform, most famously codified in the 17th century, but with its principles extending to earlier outbreaks, was not a deliberate attempt to create a figure of Gothic horror, though it certainly succeeded in doing so. It was a machine for survival. It was a deeply considered, theory-driven, head-to-toe suit of personal protective equipment, a self-contained environment designed to insulate the wearer from the toxic miasma that enveloped the world outside. It was a product of the best medical science of its day. And to wear it was to experience a unique and profound form of misery, a daily crucifixion of the senses that was suffocating, isolating, and ultimately, tragically, useless. Let us build this cage of leather and herbs from the inside out, beginning with the very core of the plague doctor's being, his breath. The centerpiece of the entire apparatus, the element that has burned itself into our collective memory, was the mask. It was a bizarre, unsettling, bird-like visage, a piece of equipment that transformed the human physician into something other, something alien. The mask typically consisted of a tight-fitting leather hood that covered the entire head, leaving no skin exposed. From the face, protruding forward, was the long, hollow beak, the feature that gave the doctor his avian, death-scavenging appearance. This beak, as we have established, was the engine of the entire anti-miasma suit. It was a primitive respirator, a personal air purification device. To understand the doctor's daily experience, one must imagine the ritual of preparing this beak each morning before venturing into the dying city. Into the hollow space, he would pack a carefully prepared, multi-layered poultice of aromatic substances. The recipe varied from doctor to doctor, a jealously guarded personal formula, but the ingredients were chosen for their power and pungency. The foundation was often a dense wad of wool or sponge soaked in vinegar, as the sharp, acidic smell was believed to be a potent counter-agent to the sweet smell of putrefaction. Then came the herbs, a fragrant arsenal against the invisible poison. There would be handfuls of dried mint, rosemary, and sage, chosen for their clean, sharp scents. There would be pungent spices, precious commodities from the East, cloves with their numbing medicinal aroma, cinnamon and camphor, a crystalline substance with a powerful, penetrating odor similar to turpentine, which was believed to clear the head and ward off pestilential vapors. There might be dried flowers, rose petals and carnations, added not just for their pleasant scent, but because their beauty was seen as the antithesis of the plague's ugliness. And finally, at the very heart of this aromatic wad would be a lump of theriac. This was the doctor's secret weapon, a complex, semi-mythical medical compound, a thick, sticky paste that could contain over 60 ingredients, including cinnamon, balsam, viper's flesh, myrrh, and a heavy dose of opium. The theriac was not only thought to be a universal antidote to poison, but its opium content would have had a real, tangible effect, producing a mild narcotic haze that perhaps helped the doctor to emotionally endure the horrors of his day. Once this potent, fragrant charge was packed tightly into the beak, the doctor would pull the leather hood over his head, securing it tightly around his neck. And in that moment, his sensory world would be irrevocably altered. The simple act of breathing would become a conscious, overwhelming experience. Every single inhalation would draw the thick, cloying, syrupy air through the dense, herbal filter. Imagine the taste of it, the feel of it in the back of the throat. It would be an overpowering fusion of sour vinegar, sharp mint, hot spices, and the heavy, sweetish fug of opium. It was a smell designed to be stronger than death, a scent so powerful it was meant to form an impenetrable wall against the stench of the world outside. But it would also be relentless. There was no escape from it. It would cling to his hair, his skin, his very being. It was the smell of his fear, the taste of his flawed protection, and he would live with it every waking, working moment. Through this oppressive olfactory filter, he had to see the world. The mask had 2 eye holes, but these were not open to the air. They were fitted with circular pieces of glass or polished crystal. This served a dual purpose. Firstly, it completed the seal of the mask, preventing any unfiltered miasma from seeping in around the eyes. Secondly, it was based on a theory of vision and contagion. Some physicians believed that the plague could be transmitted through sight, that a pestilential dart could leap from the eye of a dying patient into the eye of the healthy. This belief stemmed from the ancient idea of the evil eye, the power of a malevolent gaze to cause harm. By placing a barrier of glass between himself and the patient, the doctor was protecting himself from this visual contagion. Often, this glass was tinted red. The reason for this is debated. It may have been to reduce the glare of the sun, or it may have been based on the belief that the color red was inherently protective and auspicious, a color of life and vigor that could ward off the forces of death. The practical reality of this feature was another layer of sensory deprivation. The glass lenses would have been crude by modern standards, uneven and likely distorting his vision. They would have constantly fogged up with the moisture of his own breath, trapped within the hot, humid confines of the leather hood. His view of the world would be a dim, blurry, often reddish panorama seen through 2 narrow, perpetually clouded portholes. It would create a profound sense of detachment, as if he were looking at the world from the bottom of a well or from within a diving bell. He was there, in the room with the dying, but he was not fully present. He was an observer, separated from reality by a veil of fogged glass and a wall of scent. This sense of separation was reinforced by the rest of the costume. Over his normal clothes, the doctor would don a long coat or mantle. This was not made of cloth, which was believed to be porous and could trap the miasma in its fibers. It was crafted from heavy, fine-grained leather, often sourced from Morocco, which had been thoroughly coated and impregnated with hardened animal fat or suet. The goal was to create a smooth, non-porous, wipe-clean surface from which the pestilential vapors would simply slide off. This waxed leather garment was a full-body shield. It reached from his neck down to his ankles, with long sleeves that connected to equally well-greased leather gloves. He wore leather breeches tucked into high leather boots, and on his head, over the mask, he placed a wide-brimmed black leather hat. The hat was not a fashion statement. It was a symbol of his profession, identifying him as a doctor, but it also served as another layer of shielding, an umbrella to deflect any descending miasma from above. When fully assembled, the doctor was encased head to toe in a single continuous sealed sheath of waxed leather. Nothing of his person was exposed to the hostile environment. He had become a walking fortress, a human armadillo. But the cost of this protection was immense physical misery. The leather was heavy, stiff, and completely unbreathable. On a hot summer day in a plague-ridden city, to be sealed inside this suit would be to inhabit a personal inferno. The heat would be intense, the air inside stagnant and thick with the smell of his own sweat, which would have nowhere to evaporate. The waxed leather would become slick and sticky against his skin. Movement would be clumsy and restricted. The simple act of walking through the streets would be an exhausting physical ordeal, each step a struggle against the weight and heat of his own protection. To complete his ensemble, the plague doctor carried a long wooden staff or cane. This, too, was a multi-purpose tool born of the need for distance and protection. Firstly, it served its obvious purpose as a walking stick, helping him navigate the treacherous, refuse-strewn streets and maintain his balance in his clumsy, heavy gear. But more importantly, it was a tool for interaction. It allowed him to perform his duties without ever having to make direct physical contact with the potentially contaminated world around him. With the end of his staff, he could lift the bedclothes of a patient to examine their sores from a safe distance. He could point to the buboes, instructing family members on where to apply a poultice. He could push aside the desperate, pleading hands of the sick who might try to grab onto him. And grimly, he could use it to feel for a pulse, or to push aside the bodies of the dead that often cluttered his path. The staff was also a tool of authority and a symbol of his office. He could use it to command onlookers to keep their distance, creating a necessary cordon of safety around himself. For a population that was largely illiterate, the distinctive silhouette of the hatted doctor with his beak and his staff was an instantly recognizable, if terrifying, symbol. It signified that this was not an ordinary man, but an official, a municipal agent, a man empowered by the state to enter the forbidden space of the plague house. It was a badge of his lonely, feared profession. Imagine the complete sensory experience. You are sealed in darkness, heat, and the overwhelming, unchanging smell of your own herbal concoction. Your vision is a blurry, reddish tunnel. Your hearing is muffled by the thick leather hood, the sounds of the outside world, the weeping, the screaming, the tolling bells, all muted and distorted, reaching you as if from a great distance. Your own body is slick with sweat, trapped in an unbreathing shell of leather. Your only interaction with the world is through the end of a wooden stick. This was not a costume, it was a sensory deprivation chamber. It was a machine designed to systematically dismantle the wearer's connection to the world and to other human beings. And here lies the ultimate, tragic irony of this elaborate, miserable apparatus. It was all for nothing. The entire suit, from the fragrant beak to the waxed boots, was built to combat an enemy that did not exist, the miasma. The true enemy, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was carried by the flea, an enemy so small as to be beneath notice. A flea could easily hide in the folds of the doctor's leather coat. It could travel on the end of his wooden staff. It could be waiting on the floor of the house he entered. The waxed leather offered no protection from a bite. The beak, with its powerful herbs, did nothing to deter an insect. The glass eyes could not ward off a microscopic bacterium. The entire elaborate defense system had a fatal flaw. It was pointed in the wrong direction. While the thick leather and full body covering might have, by sheer dumb luck, offered some minimal protection by preventing fleas from easily reaching the skin, this was a happy accident, not a function of the theory. Many plague doctors, despite their precautions, still sickened and died. They would die believing that somewhere, somehow, a tiny wisp of the bad air had breached their defenses. They would never know that their 6-inch herb-filled beak was defeated by a creature less than 6 millimeters long. The costume, therefore, was the ultimate symbol of the plague doctor's plight. It was a prison of the body and the senses, a source of profound physical misery and social isolation, and a monument to the tragic, heroic, and absolute futility of his entire existence. It was the cage he built for himself, a cage designed to keep the plague out, but one that only served to lock his own misery in. Having sealed himself within the suffocating armor of his profession, a walking fortress against a world he perceived as a poisonous vapor, the plague doctor was now ready to do his work. But the term work, like doctor, is a deceptively simple word for a profoundly complex and horrifying reality. His task was not to practice medicine as we would understand it, a gentle art of healing and comfort. He was a creature of contract, a municipal employee whose duties were stark, grim, and dictated by a medical philosophy that was both intellectually intricate and practically barbaric. He was a physician, a medico, yet the concept of a cure for the great pestilence was a cruel and distant fiction, a theoretical possibility whispered about in universities but almost never witnessed in the charnel houses that the cities of Europe had become. His true function was not to heal. It was to manage the cascade of death, to process the dying, and to perform a series of brutal, theory-driven rituals upon the bodies of the sick. These rituals, a terrifying fusion of ancient authority, astrological fatalism, and folk magic, constituted his medical arsenal. To step across the threshold of a plague-stricken house alongside this spectral figure is to enter a theatre of agony, a sacred space of suffering where good intentions and bad science conspired to inflict a unique and terrible form of torture upon the afflicted. His toolkit was not filled with remedies. It was an arsenal of profound and soul-crushing futility, and every single instrument in it was designed to fight the wrong war. The primary, central, and most dramatic procedure in the plague doctor's repertoire, the act that most defined his hands-on practice, was the treatment of the bubo. This grotesque and agonizingly painful swelling of the lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, or neck was the defining clinical sign of the bubonic form of the plague. Through the lens of Galenic humoral theory, the bubo was interpreted with a kind of desperate optimism. It was not seen as a devastating symptom of a systemic bacterial infection. Instead, it was viewed as the body's noble and valiant effort to fight the disease. The vital heat of the heart, the body's central furnace, was believed to be battling the cold, corrupting poison of the plague miasma. The bubo was the battlefield. It was the physical location where the body had successfully corralled the pestilential humor, pushing it out from the vital organs to the surface, where it collected as a pocket of venom. The doctor's role, therefore, was not to shrink the swelling, but to assist in this natural process of expulsion. He was to act as a midwife to this morbid birth, to open a gateway for the concentrated poison to escape the body before it could overwhelm the heart. This interpretation, so logical within its own framework, dictated a course of treatment that was invasive, excruciating, and almost certainly lethal. Imagine the full, multi-sensory horror of the scene. The plague doctor, a figure of terrifying strangeness in his beaked mask and waxed leather coat, steps into a low-ceilinged, airless room. The air inside is thick and heavy, a palpable entity composed of the smell of feverish sweat, vomit, feces, and the uniquely sweet, cloying odor of necrotic tissue. Even the powerful herbs in his mask cannot entirely block it out. The stench of death seeps in at the edges, a constant reminder of the virulence of the miasma he believes he is fighting. On a wretched straw pallet lies his patient, perhaps a young merchant, a mother, a child, their body burning with fever, their mind adrift in a sea of delirium. The patient's whimpers of pain are the only sound in the room, save for the frantic, whispered prayers of a terrified family member huddled in the corner. The doctor, moving with a deliberate, practiced slowness dictated by his restrictive costume, would begin his examination. Using his long wooden staff, a tool of safe distance, he would lift the soiled linen sheet covering the patient. There, in the groin or armpit, would be the object of his attention, the bubo. A tense, purplish, egg-sized swelling, hot to the touch, the skin stretched taut and shiny over the inflamed node. He would nod gravely, his face hidden behind the impassive mask. The diagnosis was confirmed. The poison was gathered. It was time to act. He would then open his medical bag, a heavy leather satchel containing the tools of his trade. For this primary procedure, his instrument of choice was the lancet. This was a small, sharp knife, often with a finely crafted handle of bone or ivory, its blade kept as keen as a razor. It was the emblem of the surgeon, but in this context, it was an instrument of pure torture. The doctor, his voice muffled and distorted by the mask, would attempt to explain the necessity of the procedure to the delirious patient or their weeping family. He would speak of letting the venom out, of assisting nature's cure. He would then proceed without any form of pain relief, for anesthesia was a concept that lay centuries in the future. He might instruct a family member to hold the patient down. Then, with a firm, practiced grip, he would make a deep, decisive incision into the most prominent part of the swollen bubo. The patient's reaction would be instantaneous and horrific. A scream of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound so primal it would seem to tear the very fabric of the air, would erupt from their lips. This was a pain beyond comprehension, the slicing of a scalpel through inflamed, nerve-rich tissue. From the wound would erupt not clean, healthy pus, but a foul-smelling, viscous and often blood-tinged fluid, a vile discharge of lymph, bacteria and necrotic cells. The doctor would peer at this horrific effluence through his fogged glass eyepieces and see not a sign of catastrophic infection, but a triumphant success. The poison was being released. His theory was being validated before his very eyes. But the procedure was not over. To simply let the bubo drain was not enough. It had to be actively purged. The doctor would then use his fingers, sheathed in their thick, suet-greased leather gloves, or a small spatula-like instrument, to squeeze and press firmly on the area surrounding the wound. He would knead the inflamed flesh, forcing out as much of the corrupted matter as possible. Each compression, each manipulation would send fresh, sickening waves of agony through the patient, who might thrash, faint, or vomit from the sheer intensity of the pain. The doctor, however, would persist, his actions driven not by cruelty, but by the cold, hard logic of his medical doctrine. The more of the black, foul humor he could expel, the better the patient's chances of survival. Once the bubo was drained to his satisfaction, the raw, gaping wound had to be treated. The goal, counterintuitive as it seems, was to prevent it from healing quickly. A clean, closed wound was a trap. The wound had to be kept open, weeping and festering, to act as a continuous drainage point for any residual poison the body might produce. To achieve this, the doctor would apply a caustic or drawing poultice. This was a plaster made from a variety of unpleasant and irritating substances. A common recipe involved a mixture of tree resin for its stickiness, lily root, and dried human excrement. The fecal matter, in a grim piece of sympathetic logic, was believed to have a natural power to draw out the body's own foulness. A piece of rough linen cloth would be slathered with this vile, stinking mixture and plastered directly onto the raw, open wound. The irritating substances would cause further inflammation and prevent the skin from closing, ensuring the wound would continue to ooze for days. Alternatively, and even more brutally, the wound could be cauterized. This was considered a highly effective method of both purifying the wound and keeping it open. The doctor would take a metal cauterizing iron from his bag, a tool with a flattened spade-like tip, and heat it in the embers of the hearth or in a small, portable brazier he might carry with him. He would wait until the tip glowed a menacing cherry red. Then, holding the patient down once more, he would press the sizzling hot metal directly into the open, bleeding sore. The sound of burning flesh, a sharp, sickening hiss, would be accompanied by another heart-stopping scream from the patient and the foul smell of their own cooked tissue. The searing of the wound with fire was thought to instantly burn away any remaining traces of the pestilential venom. More importantly, the third-degree burn it created would destroy the surrounding tissue, forming a hard, necrotic crust, or eschar, which would slough off slowly over many days, preventing the wound from healing and allowing it to continue to drain. The patient was then left in a state of profound shock, their body weakened by the fever, their mind shattered by the pain, and now bearing a new, agonizing, and highly infected wound. The risk of this entire procedure, the unsterilized knife, the unwashed hands, the filth-based poultice, the burn, introducing a secondary bacterial infection like Staphylococcus or Streptococcus, was not just high, it was virtually guaranteed. This secondary infection would then lead to fatal sepsis. The doctor, in his desperate theory-driven attempt to let the poison of the plague out, had simply opened a new, more direct door for death to walk in. When he returned a day or two later to find his patient dead, he would not see it as a failure of his treatment, but as a testament to the overwhelming virulence of the miasma, a foe too powerful even for his most potent interventions. Beyond the direct assault on the buboes, the doctor's arsenal contained other weapons, each just as futile. Another common approach to the bubo, rooted in folk magic and the doctrine of signatures, was the application of live or recently killed animals. One of the most widespread and bizarre of these treatments was the live chicken or live pigeon cure, a practice known as vicary sucking. A live chicken would be procured and the feathers would be plucked from its rump or vent. Its raw, exposed backside would then be pressed directly against the patient's unlanced bubo. The chicken was held there, squawking and struggling, until it either died or the bubo burst. The bizarre theory behind this was that the chicken, a creature of natural warmth and vitality, would act as a living vacuum cleaner, its life force literally drawing the plague's cold venom out of the human body and into its own. When the chicken inevitably sickened from the heat and stress and died, it was presented to the grieving family as irrefutable proof that the treatment was working. The poison had been successfully transferred. A fresh chicken would then be applied and the process would be repeated, sometimes for hours. The sick room would fill with the frantic flapping and squawking of terrified poultry and the stench of their droppings, adding another layer of surreal, nightmarish horror to the scene. A variation of this involved cutting a dried toad, a creature associated with the earth and its cold, dark poisons, in half and applying the still warm entrails to the bubo. The toad's body, it was believed, had a natural affinity for absorbing the cold poison of the plague. Similarly, spiders, seen as collectors of venom, would be sealed in a small pouch and hung over the bubo, in the hope they would draw out the pestilence. These treatments, born of desperation and magical thinking, subjected the patient to further indignity and surrounded them with the filth and terror of dying animals in their final moments. When the plague manifested in its more deadly forms, pneumonic, attacking the lungs, or septicemic, overwhelming the bloodstream, the doctor's arsenal was even more limited and his actions often even more directly harmful. For the pneumonic plague, which caused a racking, bloody cough and was almost 100% fatal, the diagnosis was a clear case of corrupted phlegm flooding the lungs. The doctor would prescribe powerful expectorants and instruct the patient to inhale the steam from a boiling pot of water infused with vinegar and herbs. The goal was to induce violent, uncontrollable coughing fits, in the desperate hope that the patient would literally expel the diseased humour from their lungs. This, of course, did nothing but exhaust the patient and spray a deadly aerosol of Yersinia pestis bacteria throughout the room, ensuring the infection of anyone else present. For the septicemic plague, which caused the high fever, the delirium, and the dark subcutaneous hemorrhaging that gave the Black Death its name, the diagnosis was a universal putrefaction of the blood. This was the most terrifying diagnosis of all, as it meant the body's most vital humour was hopelessly corrupted. This called for the most trusted, most ancient, and most universal of all medieval therapies, phlebotomy. The plague doctor, though he might not wield the lancet himself, would oversee the bloodletting of his septicemic patients with a conviction born of centuries of unshakable medical tradition. He would instruct the barber surgeon on the precise vein to open, often engaging in complex calculations based on the patient's astrological chart to determine the most auspicious location. The blood that emerged from a septicemic plague victim was often dark, almost black, viscous, and slow to coagulate due to the systemic failure of the body's clotting factors. To the doctor, this was not a symptom of disseminated intravascular coagulation. It was horrifying, irrefutable, visual proof that the blood itself was a corrupt and poisonous sludge. The logical, indeed the only response was to remove as much of it as possible. They would bleed patients who were already in a state of profound circulatory shock, whose blood pressure was plummeting, and whose hearts were struggling to pump a sufficient volume of blood to their vital organs. They drained the life-giving fluid from bodies that desperately needed every last red blood cell to carry oxygen, and every last platelet to prevent further hemorrhaging. The act of bloodletting in this context was akin to dousing a fire with gasoline. The patient would often die during the procedure, their body finally giving out under the combined assault of the disease and the cure. They would faint into a final, irreversible coma, an outcome the physician might solemnly interpret as the body being overwhelmed by the sheer virulence of the humour he was trying so valiantly to remove. Beyond these invasive, hands-on procedures, the plague doctor's toolkit included a pharmacopoeia of desperation, a cabinet of curiosities filled with potions and pills that ranged from the merely useless to the actively toxic. Believing the plague to be a form of poison that had entered the body, the most sought-after remedies were so-called antidotes, or counterpoisons. The aforementioned theriac, that complex shotgun blast of a remedy, was a key ingredient administered orally in vast quantities. Another prized substance was unicorn horn, which was almost always the long, spiraled tusk of a narwhal whale, imported at an astronomical price from the frozen seas of the north. This tusk would be powdered and mixed with water or wine, its mythical purity believed to be a universal panacea, capable of neutralizing any poison. Emeralds, pearls, and other precious gems would be painstakingly ground into a fine powder and mixed into cordials. The theory was that these pure, noble, and incorruptible substances could not coexist with the impurity and corruption of the plague. By ingesting them, the patient's body would be fortified and cleansed from within, driving out the pestilence through the sheer force of their inherent value and purity. When these expensive and benign remedies inevitably failed, more dangerous and desperate ones were tried. Alchemical concoctions containing small, supposedly therapeutic doses of powerful poisons like arsenic, mercury, and antimony were prescribed. The idea was that these potent substances could, in a controlled manner, fight the greater poison of the plague. It was a desperate, fights-like philosophy, a medical gamble that often resulted in the patient being systematically poisoned by their cure long before they could be killed by the disease. The plague doctor's preventative advice and his public health duties were just as rooted in flawed theory and often resulted in a particular kind of state-sanctioned cruelty. While his advice to flee an infected area was the only sound counsel he could offer, it was a luxury most people could not afford. For those who remained trapped in the dying cities, the doctor's instructions created a life of fearful, joyless paralysis. He would prescribe specific diets, often emphasizing sour and acidic foods like vinegar, citrus fruits, when available, and unripe apples. The cold and dry properties of these foods were believed to counteract the hot and moist corruption that was thought to characterize the plague's miasma. He would command the populace to avoid all sources of joy, pleasure, and passion. Laughter, singing, and sexual activity were strictly forbidden, as these activities were believed to heat up the body and open the soul to the invasion of pestilential vapors. The ideal citizen in a time of plague was to be somber, chaste, and fearful. He even advised against bathing. The public bathhouses, a central part of medieval social life, were closed down. Warm water and steam were believed to open the pores of the skin, creating thousands of tiny, invisible gateways for the miasma to enter the body. To be safe was to be unwashed. Perhaps the most soul-destroying part of his job, the duty that transformed him from a mere failed healer into an active agent of suffering, was his role as a legal and sanitary official of the state. The plague doctor's contract with the city required him to be its eyes and ears in the war against the pestilence. He had a legal obligation to diagnose and report every case of plague he encountered. Once his diagnosis was made, the consequences for the afflicted household were swift and terrible. The house would be placed under official quarantine by the city magistrates. The front door would be marked with a large red or black cross, a stark and terrifying warning to all who passed. Guards would be posted outside to prevent anyone from entering or leaving. Often, the door would be boarded or even bricked up, sealing the entire family, the sick and the healthy alike, inside for a period of 40 days, a quarantina, the origin of our modern word. The plague doctor was the man who pronounced this sentence. He was the one whose diagnosis condemned entire families to be entombed together. He forced the healthy, the terrified spouse, the weeping children, to live in close quarters with their dying relatives, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, and almost certainly ensuring that no one would emerge from that house alive. It was a brutal, pragmatic measure designed to contain the spread of the disease by sacrificing the few for the many. But it turned the doctor into a figure of profound dread, a man who wielded the power to wall up his neighbors in their own homes. He was also required to act as a legal witness. He would be present for the frantic scribbling of last wills and testaments, his signature on the document providing a veneer of officialdom to the final, desperate dispositions of the dying. And he had to keep records. With a steady, dispassionate hand, he was required to maintain a daily tally of the dead, reducing the immense, overwhelming human tragedy he witnessed every single day to a set of cold, hard numbers for the city magistrates. He was, in this sense, less a healer and more a morbid accountant, a bookkeeper for the apocalypse. This, then, was the plague doctor's daily work. It was a relentless, repetitive cycle of brutal, invasive procedures that caused unimaginable pain and offered no hope of a cure. It was the prescribing of useless, often toxic potions and the enforcement of cruel, isolating public health measures that tore families apart. He would move from house to house, a spectre of death in his bird-like mask, a harbinger of suffering, leaving a trail of lanced, cauterized and bleeding patients in his wake. He would do this day after day, week after week, surrounded by the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence of his own failure. Every patient he treated was a testament to the inadequacy of his art. Every corpse he tallied was a monument to the absolute futility of his efforts. He was a soldier armed with an arsenal built for a phantom war, firing volleys of poison and pain at an enemy he could not see and did not understand, while the true, silent, microscopic plague continued its merciless conquest of the world all around him. His job was not just to witness hell, it was to be one of its most active and tormented functionaries. We have explored the flawed mind of the plague doctor, we have inhabited the suffocating misery of his costume, and we have witnessed the brutal futility of his medical arsenal. But to truly understand the depth of his suffering, we must now step outside of the sick room and walk with him through the streets of the dying city. We must see him not as he saw himself, a learned physician, a contracted official, a soldier in the war against a poisonous miasma, but as the public saw him. To the terrified, grief-stricken populace of a plague-ridden town, he was not a figure of hope. He was not a welcome savior. He was a walking omen, a spectre of death given human form. His arrival was a harbinger of the end. He was the man who came only when all hope was lost. His strange, bird-like silhouette was as much a symbol of the plague as the black sores and the death carts. To be a plague doctor was to suffer a kind of social death long before the pestilence could claim your physical life. It was to be utterly, profoundly, and terrifyingly alone, an outcast feared and ostracized by the very community you were paid to serve. Imagine the doctor beginning his day. He emerges from the small, isolated house or room that the city has designated for his use. A dwelling often located near the pest house or the graveyard, far from the healthy quarters of the town. This isolation was not a matter of personal preference, it was a contractual obligation. As a man who waded daily through the pestilence, he himself was considered a potential source of contagion, a walking vessel of miasma. He was forbidden from entering the homes of the healthy, from frequenting taverns or markets, from attending church services with the general congregation. He was forbidden from touching his own wife or children if he was foolish or desperate enough to have them living in the same city. His life outside of his duties was one of strict, mandated quarantine. He was a pariah by law, his human need for contact and community sacrificed at the altar of public health. He steps into the street and the world shies away from him. The narrow, cobblestoned lane, already eerily quiet save for the distant tolling of a church bell or the wail of a mourner, becomes even quieter at his approach. The few healthy people who have dared to venture out on some urgent errand would see his distinctive, dreadful silhouette approaching, and would immediately flatten themselves against a wall, turning their faces away and covering their noses and mouths, not just with a cloth, but with a hand making a gesture to ward off evil. Mothers would grab their children and pull them into doorways. Windows that had been open to catch a rare breeze would be slammed shut. Doors would be barred. The sound of his own footsteps and the tap-tap-tapping of his long wooden staff on the stones would be the only sounds in the bubble of fear that moved with him. He was a leper, but worse. A leper's bell warned of the approach of a sick man, but the plague doctor's silent presence warned of the approach of death itself. He was the harbinger, the man whose professional duty was to confirm the presence of the plague in a household. His visit was not a house call, it was a final verdict. When a family member fell ill with a fever, a desperate hope might still flicker. Perhaps it was a simple ague, a summer sickness, an imbalance of the humours that could be corrected. They would try their own remedies, pray to their patron saints, and watch and wait. But when the telltale bubo appeared, a hard, painful lump in the groin or armpit, that hope was extinguished. It was at this point, and only at this point, that the plague doctor would be summoned or would arrive, having been alerted by a neighbour or a parish priest. His appearance on a family's doorstep was the official confirmation of their worst fears. He was the face of the sentence that had been passed upon them. The hope that had sustained them now curdled into a black despair at the sight of his masked visage. The relationship between the doctor and his patients was therefore not one of trust and comfort, but one of profound fear and often outright hostility. The family did not see a healer arriving to ease their loved one's suffering. They saw a ghoulish figure, an agent of the state whose primary purpose was to condemn their house. They knew that his diagnosis would lead to the Red Cross being painted on their door, to the guards being posted outside, to their home being transformed into a prison, a tomb in which they would all be sealed, the healthy with the sick, to await their turn. Is it any wonder that they might greet him with suspicion, with curses, with a desperate, futile attempt to deny the reality of the symptoms? "It is just a swelling from a fall, doctor," they might plead. A simple abscess. But the doctor, hardened by the daily repetition of this scene, would proceed with his grim examination, his diagnosis a foregone conclusion. He was also seen as a vulture, a man who profited from the suffering of others. The common people knew that these Medici della Peste were paid exorbitant sums by the city. While the rest of the world was collapsing, while merchants were going bankrupt and labourers were starving, the plague doctor was earning a fortune. This bred a deep and bitter resentment. He was seen as a man feasting on the misery of his neighbours. This perception was often amplified by the doctors themselves. Many, as we have discussed, were not driven by altruism, but by pure opportunism. Unscrupulous doctors would extort desperate families, offering false hopes and secret miracle cures for vast sums of money. They would sell worthless amulets and protective potions at inflated prices. The Historia Augusta's descriptions of charlatans selling fake remedies during the earlier plague of Cyprian would have felt vividly real to the people of the 14th century. This reputation for avarice clung to all plague doctors, the honest and the dishonest alike, further poisoning their relationship with the public. They were not just feared as harbingers of death, but despised as ghoulish profiteers. His legal duties further cemented his role as an administrator of death rather than a giver of life. A significant part of his contractual obligation was to serve as an official witness for the wills and testaments of the dying. In a time of such rapid and widespread mortality, the legal transfer of property became a major concern for the city authorities. The doctor, as one of the few officials willing to enter an infected house, was empowered to witness the final, hastily scribbled bequests of a dying merchant or craftsman. He would stand at the foot of the bed, his staff in hand, as a dying man dictated his last wishes, ensuring the document was legally valid. In this role, he was not a physician, but a notary of the apocalypse. He was there to ensure an orderly transition of material wealth in a world where the transition from life to death had become terrifyingly disorderly. Furthermore, some contracts required the plague doctor to perform or at least be present at autopsies. This was a deeply controversial and often forbidden practice in the medieval world. The cutting open of a human body was seen by many as a desecration of God's creation, a sinful act of mutilation. But desperate city officials, trying to understand the nature of the pestilence, would order these post-mortem examinations. The plague doctor would be tasked with opening the corpse of a victim to observe the internal state of the organs. He would note the blackened lungs of a pneumonic victim or the state of the spleen and liver in a septicemic one. This grim work, while a tentative step towards empirical medical investigation, further solidified his ghoulish reputation. He was a man who trafficked with the dead, who cut open corpses, who peered into the body's most secret and sacred spaces. This associated him with dark arts, with a kind of knowledge that was seen as unnatural and unholy. This profound social isolation, the fear he inspired, the resentment he provoked, the ghoulish nature of his duties, must have had a devastating psychological effect. Humans are social creatures, hardwired for connection, empathy, and community. The plague doctor's profession was a systematic denial of all these things. He was a man forced to live in a state of perpetual emotional winter. Every human he interacted with professionally was either dying or terrified of dying. Every encounter was freighted with grief, fear, and despair. He could offer no real comfort because his very presence was a source of terror. He could not offer a reassuring touch, as his leather-gloved hand was a symbol of his own fear of contamination. He was a lonely planet, moving through a dying solar system, his orbit keeping him forever at a distance from the warmth of human contact. Imagine the crushing weight of this isolation. After a long, harrowing day of lancing buboes, witnessing agonizing deaths, and condemning families to be walled up in their homes, he would return not to a welcoming family or a cheerful tavern, but to his own silent, empty, designated room. There, he would have to perform the ritual of decontamination. He would carefully remove his waxed leather uniform, piece by piece, wiping it down, perhaps fumigating it with the smoke of sulfur or aromatic herbs. He would wash himself, but the feeling of contamination, the stench of death that seemed to cling to his very soul, could not be so easily scrubbed away. He would eat his meal alone, he would sleep alone, and in the silence of the night, the sounds of the day would return to him, the screams of his patients, the weeping of their children, the curses of those who saw him as a vulture. There was no one to talk to, no one to share the burden with, no one to offer a word of comfort or understanding. He was an island of misery in an ocean of sorrow. This isolation would have been particularly acute for the doctors who were truly conscientious, the ones who genuinely believed in their art and felt the sting of their own futility most keenly. To be surrounded by such overwhelming evidence of your own failure day after day, with no one to confide in, would be a recipe for profound despair. How does a man maintain his sanity when his entire professional life is a testament to his own powerlessness? Some may have turned to drink, seeking oblivion in the bottom of a cup. Others may have developed a hard, cynical shell, a calloused indifference that allowed them to perform their gruesome duties without feeling. They would have learned to see their patients not as suffering human beings, but as collections of symptoms, as corrupted humours to be purged, as numbers to be tallied in their death ledgers. This dehumanization of the patient would have been a necessary psychological defense mechanism, but it would have come at the cost of their own humanity. They had to kill their own empathy to survive the day. And what of the very few who did survive? What happened when the plague finally burned itself out in a city and the doctor's contract was fulfilled? Was he hailed as a hero, a man who had bravely stood his ground while others fled? Was he paid his promised fortune and allowed to retire in comfort? The historical record is sparse, but the likely reality is far grimmer. A man who had spent months or years as the living embodiment of the plague would not be easily welcomed back into a recovering community. His face, now unmasked, would forever be associated with the city's darkest hour. He was a walking, talking reminder of the trauma that everyone was desperately trying to forget. The healthy survivors would see him and remember the red cross on a neighbor's door, the sound of the death cart, the sight of their own loved ones being dragged from their homes. He was a ghost from a past they wished to bury. It is likely that many were paid their due and then quietly encouraged or overtly forced to leave the city. Their presence was too painful, their association with death too strong. They would take their blood money and move on, forever marked by what they had seen and done. They were the ultimate survivors, but they were also the ultimate outcasts. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, but the shadow had clung to them, becoming a permanent part of their being. The social death they had experienced during the plague was not a temporary condition. It was a lifelong sentence. They were men set apart, men who had seen the absolute collapse of the human world and had been tasked with sweeping up the debris. They were not heroes, they were not villains, they were simply the lonely, feared, and despised janitors of the apocalypse. We have walked with the plague doctor through a hostile world, sealed within his suffocating costume, wielding his arsenal of futile treatments. We have felt the sting of his social isolation, the fear and contempt that radiated from every living person he encountered. But now we must undertake the most harrowing journey of all. We must attempt to breach the final layer of his leather and wax armor. We must venture past the beak, past the glass eyes, and into the dark, silent, and tormented landscape of his own mind. For the greatest misery of the plague doctor was not the risk of infection, the physical discomfort, or the public loathing. It was the slow, relentless, and inescapable erosion of his own soul. It was the profound psychological trauma of being a constant, powerless witness to the end of the world. A trauma that would have haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. A private pestilence against which his herbs and his theories offered no protection whatsoever. The assault on the doctor's psyche began with a full-scale, unrelenting attack on his senses. The human mind builds its reality from the information it receives through sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. For the plague doctor, every single one of these senses became a conduit for pure, undiluted horror. Let us first consider the sense of smell, the very sense his mask was designed to conquer. The powerful, cloying aroma of the herbs and vinegar within his beak was a constant, oppressive presence, a smell he could never escape. But it was not a perfect seal. The stench of a plague-ridden city, a stench of an intensity we can barely imagine, would have seeped in at the edges, tainting the fragile purity of his protective perfume. It was the multi-layered smell of mass death. There was the smell of unwashed, feverish bodies, the sour, acidic smell of vomit, the acrid stench of dysentery, and underneath it all, there was the unique, sickly sweet, saccharine odor of putrefaction, the smell of human flesh beginning to decay even before life had fully departed. This smell would have been his constant companion, a ghost that followed him from house to house, clinging to his clothes and his hair, a permanent reminder of the corruption he was fighting. He would return to his lonely room at night, and the smell would still be there, a phantom in his own nostrils. Then there was the assault on his hearing. The medieval city was a place of noise, but the plague transformed its soundscape into a symphony of suffering. His world, muffled by his thick leather hood, would have been a hell of distorted sounds. The primary sound was the ceaseless, rhythmic tolling of the church bells. The Requiem Aeternam, a slow, ponderous drumbeat marking the endless procession of the dead. This was the city's heartbeat, and its rhythm was death. Superimposed on this was the cacophony of human grief. From every street, through every boarded-up window, would come the sounds of weeping, the raw, animal howls of parents who had lost a child, the desperate, shrieking prayers of the dying. And then there were the screams of his own patients, the high-pitched, piercing cries of pure agony as he lanced their buboes or cauterized their sores. These sounds would have burrowed deep into his memory. He would lie in his bed at night, and the silence would be filled with their echoes. The bells, the weeping, the screams. This was the soundtrack to his life, a composition of pure human misery. And what of the things he was forced to see? His vision, filtered through the dim, fogged, reddish glass of his mask, would have been a perpetual slideshow of horrors. He would be the last person to see the life fade from a child's eyes. He would witness the terror and despair on the faces of entire families as he pronounced their quarantine, the moment they realized their home had become their tomb. He would see the physical devastation wrought by the disease, the blackened limbs of septicemic victims, the blood coughed up by pneumonic patients, the grotesque, disfiguring swellings of the buboes. He would see the bodies of the dead, often left for days in the summer heat, bloating and turning black, their features distorted into monstrous parodies of the human face. He would see the death carts piled high with these anonymous tangled corpses, a jumble of limbs and heads, indistinguishable in their shared degradation. These images, even viewed through a distorted lens, would be burned onto the canvas of his mind's eye, reappearing as nightmares, as intrusive flashes during a quiet moment. He was a collector of last moments, a curator of final horrific images. This unrelenting sensory assault was the backdrop for the central psychological drama of his existence, the soul-crushing burden of his own failure. The plague doctor was a physician, a man trained in a discipline that, for all its flaws, was built on the premise of healing. He entered his profession with the belief, however misguided, that he possessed knowledge and skills that could alleviate suffering and restore health. The plague stripped this belief away, day by day, death by death, with a brutal and systematic efficiency. Imagine the psychological toll of this constant, irrefutable failure. He would perform his treatments with the full force of his intellectual conviction. He would lance the bubo, convinced he was releasing the poison. He would let the blood, certain he was correcting a fatal humoral imbalance. He would prescribe his expensive potions, believing he was offering a powerful antidote. And then he would watch his patient die. Not sometimes, not often, but almost every single time. The plague, particularly in its pneumonic and septicemic forms, had a mortality rate that approached 100%. The bubonic form was only slightly more survivable. The doctor's daily reality was that virtually everyone he treated, everyone he subjected to his painful and terrifying procedures, perished. How does the human mind cope with such overwhelming evidence of its own impotence? The first stage might be a frantic doubling down on his theories. If the patient died, it could not be because the treatment was wrong, it must be because the treatment was not aggressive enough. He would lance the next bubo deeper, let more blood, prescribe a more potent and toxic poison. He would become more fervent in his belief, his actions becoming more extreme in a desperate attempt to achieve a different result. But the results would remain the same. The dead would continue to pile up. This would inevitably lead to a profound crisis of confidence, not just in himself, but in the entire foundation of his worldview. His faith in Galen, in the wisdom of the ancients, in the very medical texts he had spent his life studying, would be shaken to its core. The elegant, ordered system of the four humours, which had an answer for everything, had no effective answer for this. The world, which had seemed so logical and comprehensible through the lens of his training, had revealed itself to be a place of chaotic, meaningless, and unconquerable virulence. This was more than just professional failure. It was an epistemological crisis, the collapse of his entire understanding of reality. He was a man whose map of the world had turned out to be a fiction, leaving him utterly lost in a terrifying and uncharted wilderness of death. For a man of faith, as most medieval people were, this crisis would have extended into the spiritual realm. How could a benevolent and omnipotent God allow such a thing to happen? How could he permit a pestilence that killed the innocent child alongside the sinner, the pious priest alongside the profligate merchant? The plague was a theological catastrophe as much as a biological one. It shattered the comforting medieval belief in a just and ordered universe, where piety was rewarded and sin was punished. The doctor, standing at the epicenter of this divine silence, witnessing the most profound and indiscriminate suffering imaginable, would have been forced to confront the deepest existential questions. He might have seen the plague as a sign of the apocalypse, a belief that he was living through the end of days as foretold in the book of Revelation. This could lead to a kind of fatalistic resignation, a sense that his actions were meaningless in the face of God's final, terrible judgment. Alternatively, the experience could lead to a complete and utter loss of faith, a descent into a bleak, atheistic nihilism. If God was either unwilling or unable to stop this horror, then what was the point of belief? What was the point of prayer? What was the point of anything? The doctor, more than anyone, saw the futility of piety. He saw the devout die just as horribly as the wicked. This daily confrontation with a silent heaven could easily curdle a man's soul, leaving him with a cynical, bitter conviction that the universe was nothing more than a blind, meaningless machine of suffering. Faced with this relentless onslaught of failure, horror, and existential dread, the plague doctor would have had to develop powerful psychological defense mechanisms to simply survive. The most common of these would have been a profound emotional detachment, a clinical callousness that allowed him to function amidst the carnage. He would have had to train himself to stop seeing his patients as people. He could no longer afford to see the young woman on the bed as someone's daughter or wife, a person with hopes and dreams. She had to become an object, a collection of symptoms, a case study in humoral pathology. The bubo was not on her body, it was simply the bubo. The dying child was not a child, it was a textbook example of pestilential fever. This process of dehumanization, while a necessary shield for his own sanity, would have come at the terrible cost of his own humanity. To kill his empathy was to kill a part of his soul. He would have become a kind of automaton, moving through his gruesome duties with a cold, mechanical efficiency, his heart locked away in a place where the screams and the weeping could not reach it. Another coping mechanism would have been the gallows humor and bleak camaraderie that often develops among people in extreme professions, like soldiers or emergency room doctors. It is possible that when two plague doctors met, a rare occurrence given their mandated isolation, their conversation would not have been one of shared grief, but of a dark, cynical humor. They might have joked about the futility of their remedies, made grimly funny observations about the bizarre ways their patients died, or placed bets on which neighborhoods would be decimated next. This was not a sign of cruelty, but a desperate attempt to hold the horror at arm's length, to turn the unbearable tragedy into a manageable, if grotesque, comedy. It was a way of laughing in the face of the abyss, because the only other option was to let the abyss swallow you whole. And what of the spectre in the mirror? What was the psychological effect of wearing that monstrous costume day after day? The mask, the beak, the dark glass eyes, it was a uniform that stripped him of his own face, his own identity. To the world, he was not a man named Thomas or Guillaume. He was simply the doctor. He was a symbol, a function, a terrifying archetype. It is a known psychological phenomenon that wearing a mask can lead to a sense of de-individuation, a loosening of normal social and moral constraints. It is possible that for some doctors, putting on the mask was a form of liberation. It allowed them to become the cold, detached, almost inhuman figure that their job required them to be. The mask gave them permission to perform the brutal, painful procedures that a normal, empathetic man would shrink from. But for others, this daily erasure of self could have been a source of profound psychological distress. He would look at his reflection in a puddle or a piece of polished metal and see not himself, but a monster, a bird of death. He would begin to internalize the fear and loathing that he saw in everyone else's eyes. He might begin to wonder if he truly was a harbinger of death, if his very presence was a curse. This could lead to a complete dissociation from his own identity, a feeling that the man he once was had died and that only the masked creature remained. He was no longer a man playing a part, he had become the part. The costume that was meant to protect his body had ended up consuming his soul. The final, crushing weight on the doctor's mind would have been the simple, stark reality of the numbers. He was a man who lived by the ledger. He counted his patients and he counted his dead. And every single day, the second number would be almost identical to the first. He was a man fighting a war in which he lost every single battle. He was a shepherd whose entire flock was being devoured by wolves one by one before his very eyes. The sheer, quantitative scale of his failure was inescapable. He could not rationalize it away. He could not blame a single mistake. It was a perfect, unbroken record of defeat. This experience would have instilled a sense of learned helplessness so profound that it is difficult to fathom. It is the psychological state of a creature that has learned, through repeated, painful experience, that none of its actions have any effect on the outcome. It is the state that leads to a complete cessation of effort, to a quiet, depressive, and total surrender. And so, the plague doctor, at the end of his long, horrific day, would retreat to his lonely room, a man hollowed out by what he had seen, what he had heard, what he had smelled, and what he had failed to do. He was a walking repository of trauma, a library of sorrow. He had faced the abyss, and the abyss had stared back and found him wanting. His soul, if it survived at all, would have been a landscape of scar tissue, a desolate place haunted by the ghosts of the thousands he had watched die, a quiet, lonely testament to the fact that there are some horrors so great that the only real choice is between dying and going mad. The pestilence, like a great fire, could not burn at its highest intensity forever. Eventually, in any given city, the plague would begin to recede. It would do so not because of any human intervention, not because of the doctor's lanced buboes or the city's smoking bonfires, but because it had simply run out of fuel. The population of susceptible hosts, both human and rodent, would be so catastrophically depleted that the chain of transmission would naturally begin to slow and then break. The daily death toll, once counted in the hundreds or thousands, would dwindle to the dozens, then to single figures, and then, one blessed day, to zero. The church bells would fall silent. The death carts would cease their grisly rounds. The living, emerging, blinking into the sunlight from their long confinement, would find themselves in a new and terrifyingly empty world. For the city, it was the beginning of a long, slow, and painful recovery. But for the plague doctor, it was the beginning of his own final reckoning. His contract was ending, and he now had to face a world that no longer needed him, but would forever be haunted by the memory of him. The most common and most predictable end for the plague doctor was, of course, death. The very contract he signed was, in most cases, a death warrant with a delayed execution date. Despite his elaborate costume, his obsessive precautions, and his profound understanding of the flawed science that was supposed to protect him, he was still a man wading through an ocean of one of the deadliest pathogens in human history. The sheer, overwhelming odds were stacked against him. His daily, intimate proximity to the sick and the dying, his work in the contaminated, flea-infested hovels that served as sick rooms, meant his exposure was constant and extreme. The belief that his waxed leather coat and fragrant beak offered a perfect shield was a comforting fiction, but a fiction nonetheless. A single flea, unnoticed, could leap from a patient's bedding onto his boot and find its way to a patch of exposed skin at the ankle. A moment of carelessness while removing his heavy, sweat-soaked gloves could be enough. The bacterium Yersinia pestis was a far more cunning and insidious enemy than the phantom miasma he was equipped to fight. And so, many, perhaps most, plague doctors would eventually feel the first telltale signs in their own bodies. The sudden, raging fever, the debilitating headache, the chills that racked their frame, and then, the ultimate horrifying irony, the discovery of a hard, painful lump in their own groin or armpit. Imagine the psychological terror of that moment. The doctor, who had seen and diagnosed this symptom thousands of times in others, now found it on himself. He, more than anyone on earth, knew exactly what it meant. He knew the agonizing progression of the disease he was about to endure. He knew the futility of every single treatment in his own medical bag. He had spent his entire career as a detached observer of this process, and now he was to become its victim. Would he attempt to treat himself? Would he, in a final, desperate act of faith in his own learning, try to lance his own bubo or bleed his own arm? Or would he simply surrender to the inevitable, knowing the utter hopelessness of his own art? He would die, most likely, as he had lived, utterly alone. No other physician would come to treat him, for he was the designated plague specialist. The community he had served would not rally around him with compassion. They would see his sickness as a grim but fitting end, a confirmation of his status as a creature of the plague, finally consumed by the force he represented. He would expire in his isolated room, his body discovered only when his daily rounds ceased. His death would be just another number to be tallied by his hastily appointed successor, his contract fulfilled not by payment, but by the ultimate cancellation clause. He was a disposable asset, a necessary functionary hired for a suicide mission, and his death was simply the final expected cost of doing business in a time of apocalypse. But what of the few who, through sheer luck, a robust immune system, or the random nature of fate, survived? What happened to the plague doctor when the city was declared clean and his contract was officially terminated? Was he hailed as a hero, a man who had bravely stared into the abyss while others had fled? Was he showered with the exorbitant fees his contract had promised, allowed to retire as a wealthy and respected citizen? The historical record is sparse on the individual fates of these men, but the likely reality is far more complex and often just as grim as that of his less fortunate colleagues. For some, the financial rewards were real. A desperate city council, relieved to be free of the pestilence, would have honored its contract, paying the surviving doctor the vast sum he had been promised. This man, who may have entered the profession as a second-rate physician or a common charlatan, would suddenly find himself fabulously wealthy. He would have the means to purchase a large house, to wear fine clothes, to live a life of leisure he could only have dreamed of before the plague. But this wealth would be tainted. It was blood money earned from the deaths of his neighbours. It would set him apart, a constant, visible reminder of his role as a profiteer of misery. He would be the man who got rich while everyone else lost everything. This could lead to a life of quiet, wealthy ostracism, a man living in a fine house but never truly welcomed into the recovering social fabric of the city. For the community, the sight of the plague doctor, now unmasked and in civilian clothes, was a painful and unwelcome reminder of a trauma they were desperate to forget. He was a ghost from their collective nightmare. His face would be forever associated with the darkest period of their history. When they saw him walking in the marketplace, they would not see a brave survivor. They would remember the red cross being painted on a door, the sound of the death cart rumbling down their street, the wailing of a neighbor, the terrifying bird-like figure entering a house from which no one would emerge alive. He was the personification of their grief and fear. To welcome him back into the community as a hero would be to welcome back the memory of the plague itself. It is far more likely that even if he was paid, he would be strongly encouraged, either officially or through social pressure, to take his newfound wealth and leave. The city needed to heal, and it could not do so as long as the living embodiment of its wound was walking in its midst. The survivor's reward was often not a place of honor, but a golden exile. Moreover, the psychological scars he carried would have made a return to any semblance of a normal life almost impossible. How does a man who has spent years witnessing unimaginable horror simply put it behind him? He would be afflicted with what modern psychology would recognize as a severe and chronic form of post-traumatic stress disorder. He would be haunted by nightmares, by intrusive flashbacks of the things he had seen and done. The simple sound of a church bell might trigger a panic attack. The smell of a sick room could transport him back to the horrors of the plague house. He would likely suffer from chronic depression, from a deep-seated cynicism about humanity and the nature of God. His personal relationships would be difficult, if not impossible. How could he connect with people whose greatest tragedy was a poor harvest or a business loss, when he carried within him the memory of entire families wiped out in a matter of days? He was a man who had seen the absolute bottom of human existence, and there was no coming back from that. He was like a soldier returning from a war so terrible that no one who hadn't been there could ever understand it, dooming him to a lifetime of internal isolation, regardless of his physical surroundings. It is in the aftermath of the Great Plagues, in the long process of cultural recovery, that the final and most enduring aspect of the plague doctor's legacy was forged. He ceased to be a real, historical figure, a collection of desperate, flawed, and often miserable men, and began his transformation into a powerful and terrifying archetype, a figure of folklore. The specific image that we now universally recognize as the Plague Doctor, the one designed by Charles Delorme in 1619, retroactively became the symbol for all plague eras, including the Great Black Death of the 14th century, even though that specific costume did not exist at the time. The image was simply too powerful, too visually perfect, to remain confined to its historical context. It became a trans-historical symbol of pestilence. Artists, particularly in the Romantic and Gothic revivals of the 18th and 19th centuries, seized upon this figure. He became a stock character in dark literature and art, a shorthand for doom, mystery, and a kind of cold, scientific malevolence. He was no longer a tragic, futile healer, but a sinister, almost supernatural being, a companion to the Grim Reaper himself. His beaked mask was no longer a primitive respirator. It was the face of a bird of prey, a scavenger feasting on the dead. His staff was not a tool of examination. It was a wizard's wand pointing out the next victim. He was absorbed into the visual language of horror, a process that continues to this day in films, video games, and popular culture, where he remains one of the most instantly recognizable and unsettling character designs. This transformation into a myth, into a cool and sinister monster, is perhaps the final indignity. It strips away the reality of his suffering, his fear, and his futility, and replaces it with a dark, romantic glamour. The truth of his misery is erased by the power of his terrifying image. In the final analysis, the plague doctor occupies a unique and tragic place in the history of medicine and human society. He represents a pivotal, agonizing moment of transition. He stood at the bloody crossroads between an old world of faith and theory and a new world that would, very slowly, begin to demand empirical evidence. The catastrophic failure of Galenic medicine during the Black Death was a deep, traumatic shock to the system. While it did not overthrow the ancient authorities overnight, it planted the first seeds of doubt. The first-hand experience of physicians who survived the plague, the recognition that their books had no answers, spurred a new interest in direct observation and anatomical dissection that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The plague doctor, in his utter and complete failure, was an unwitting catalyst for the very medical progress that would one day render his own profession obsolete. He stands, therefore, as a monument, not a monument to heroism or success, but a monument to the terrifying and unbridgeable gap between human intention and human understanding in the face of an overwhelming, incomprehensible catastrophe. He is a symbol of the profound danger of certainty, the deadly arrogance of a system of knowledge that refuses to question its own assumptions. He embodies the tragic truth that, for much of human history, the only thing more dangerous than the disease was the cure. He was a man defined by a contract, trapped in a costume, armed with an arsenal of pain, and doomed to a life of isolation and failure. To remember him as a cool, sinister monster is to miss the point entirely. The truth is far more terrifying. He was not a monster. He was a man, a desperate, flawed, and profoundly miserable human being, forced to play the part of a doctor in a world where healing was impossible and tasked with the single worst job in history. And so we pull back the leather hood and step out of the past. The spectral figure of the doctor recedes, leaving us in the quiet of our own time. The air we breathe is clean. The silence is no longer filled with the tolling of bells. The story of the plague doctor is a journey into a world of profound darkness, but it is also a testament to a strange and desperate kind of courage. It is the courage of the person who, faced with an apocalypse they cannot comprehend, still gets up in the morning, puts on their uniform, and walks into the fire, armed with nothing but flawed ideas and the grim determination to do something. His history is a chilling lesson, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones that lurk in the shadows of our imagination, but the ones that are born from the bright, confident light of our own certainty. He is a monument to the humility that is learned only in the face of absolute failure. Look around your room, listen to the sounds of the world you inhabit. They are the sounds of a world that the plague doctor, in his wildest dreams, could never have imagined. His story is over, but his lonely tapping staff echoes still. Thank you for listening, and good night.